So this is the second part in a series on intelligence analysis skills. We've talked a little bit about judgment and looked at Phil Tetlock's research on what makes for better judgment and what makes for worse. Today we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of forecasting. And the place to start that conversation is to kind of introduce two different perspectives on what makes for good forecasting. One perspective, which I'm going to sort of attribute to Phil Tetlock, and his work in his book Super Forecasting, which is grounded in expert-oriented prediction, right? That there are people out there who have lots of detailed knowledge, who have sort of trained themselves to be good and careful forecasters, and that these people are well positioned to make good and effective predictions. Although Tetlock tends to note that experts versus non-experts, the difference isn't quite as great. What really matters is whether you sort of have that orientation as a fox rather than as a hedgehog. Bruce Bonner de Mesquita takes a very different view of how to do an effective forecast. He's very skeptical that area experts with very specialized knowledge are able to make good predictions about the world and good forecasts about the world. He favors instead having a solid theoretical model that will help us to sort of cut through the clutter and the complexity of different situations and sort of narrow in on the handful of things that we need to understand to be able to make useful predictions. And so while Tetlock tends to be very skeptical about people who have sort of a single model for analyzing the world, Bonner de Mesquita has done some work for the intelligence community and believes that his predictioneers model is very good, particularly at making conditional forecasts, at thinking through logic systems and different possibilities and coming to fairly precise forecasts about what might happen. And so I want to briefly introduce the predictioneers model, and then I'll run through an example of this that's based on a question I was asked by a student a number of years ago, just as things were heating up between Russia and Ukraine. And the student asked me to make a prediction and a forecast about what I thought would happen. And I was doing a lot of background reading on forecasting and predicting at the time. And so I actually penciled out and did the predictioneers model to sort of see how it would play out in that particular case. And so the way that this works is you identify all the possible outcomes of a situation and place them on a continuum from 0 to 100. And this is, a really artificial and sort of fake sort of idea. And so in the case of Russia and Ukraine, I sort of thought, well, what would be sort of Russia's ideal point? What would be sort of Ukraine's ideal point? And I kind of mapped out the space of between those two sort of poles. It's a little bit tricky because when you're talking about more than two actors, right, they can have, different competing perspectives. But the idea is to sort of create sort of a continuum of all the possible options available in the situation and sort of score them on that continuum. I consider this to be the hardest step in this whole process. It's the one that I find to be the most subjective and the one that I think is probably, if you get this wrong, you're going to have a hard time using your model in a effective and useful way, which is one of the reasons why I do this sort of illustration to show how this might work. Secondly, we identify all the actors that we think are going to be involved, that we think have a critical role to play in that particular decision or outcome. And we're going to identify 3 attributes about each of those actors. We're going to identify their influence, right? Essentially how much power can they wield in general in that process. Salience, which is how much they actually care about that particular issue, right? So just because you're powerful, just because you have a lot of influence, doesn't mean that you're inclined to use that power and that influence in this particular situation. And then thirdly, what is that actor's ideal point? If they could pick a point on that continuum that you created from 0 to 100 of all the possible outcomes, where would they fall on that particular place? So how much power does the actor have? How much does the actor care? And what does the actor want? And Bonner de Mesquita says that anybody who professes to be an expert in an area should be able to sort of identify who the actors are and assign values for these 3 things. And if you can't do that, you're probably not an expert, that it doesn't take, incredibly sophisticated understandings of the situation to be able to do this. If you follow The Economist magazine on a regular basis, you probably have most of the information you need to be able to sort of make a reasonably good estimate for these three different factors. Okay, so on to this case about Russia and Ukraine and what's likely to happen. And the case that was given to me by a student for a forecast is, do you think that Russia is going to seize Crimea? And I gave sort of a windy explanation where I said, no, I really don't think that that's likely, that in the past what has happened has been Russia has sort of fostered sort of internal conflict, supported rebels, created leverage to have ongoing power over Ukraine, but I think it'd be unlikely for them to seize Crimea. I was wrong on that forecast. But again, Buona de Mesquita would say you were wrong because you were trying to think through it like an expert. You were trying to think through examples and situations and wrestle with the complexity rather than stepping back and seeing sort of the big picture of what's going on. And when we step back and see the big picture, we can maybe think about what are the possible outcomes. And so on maybe one extreme, Russia simply takes over all of Ukraine. So we'll call that 100. And on the other continuum, Ukraine remains fully independent from Russia, but also, gains membership in the European Union, gains membership in NATO, sort of puts itself in a position to have sort of full territorial autonomy and protection from Russia. In between there, I sort of marked down as at 85, Russia gets the Russian areas of Ukraine. So in the eastern part of Ukraine, there's some Russian speaking areas, and Russia would get influence over the rest of Ukraine. Sort of my guess of what would happen. Well, actually, I should say my guess was 65. Russia retains influence over a territorially stable Ukraine. Russia doesn't tear off territory, but it has a lever in ongoing conflict that it's able to use. 50, I thought maybe Russia gets the Russian areas but loses influence over Ukraine. Maybe Ukraine is split in half and half of it goes into the West and half of it remains part of Russia's sphere of influence. Versus Ukraine gets full foreign policy autonomy. They broker a deal. Ukraine gets to do its own thing. Russia agrees to leave it alone, but it doesn't join the EU or NATO. And so you could quibble about the relative numbers I've assigned here. Maybe I missed a possible outcome, but I think I've got a pretty good range of different ways that this could play out. And I think I've arranged them in a continuum from maybe what Russia would most likely want to what Ukraine would most likely want. Again, not saying it's 100% right, but this is sort of a useful starting point for this conversation about whether or not, about how we should think about this particular problem. So then I went to the step 2. I said, who are the important actors? And I identified 3 important actors. I identified Russia, identified sort of the West or NATO or Europe or the European Union or however you want to talk about that. And then identified the Ukraine, sorry, not the Ukraine, the country, versus the Ukraine, the region. And identified what I thought would the influence, the salience, and the ideal point for these different actors, right? And so for Russia, Russia is a very powerful country. It's sitting right on the border of Ukraine. It has a lot of influence. It also cares a lot about this particular issue. It feeds into Russia's sort of image of itself in terms of foreign policy. It feeds into sort of protecting Russian co-ethnics. This is something that Russia is going to care a lot about. And what is Russia's ideal point? I said Russia's ideal point is to essentially rebuild the Soviet Union by bringing Ukraine fully back under Russia's sphere of influence. For the West or NATO or Europe, they have a lot of influence, very powerful actors involved, but maybe their salience isn't quite as great. The United States has a lot of things that it cares about. The future of Ukraine is certainly important, but it is not the most important thing. Likewise, Germany cares about a lot of things. So I set the salience fairly low. And for the ideal point, I set that sort of point somewhere between Ukraine gets full territorial autonomy and maybe isn't quite in the European Union or NATO, but is maybe leaning toward the West. I thought that that would be a reasonable thing for the United or for NATO countries to maybe advocate for and push for. And then for Ukraine, I set Ukraine's influence fairly low at 15, thinking while Ukraine sort of has the home territory advantage in this situation, they're not a great power. They're facing off against countries that are much more powerful. The salience, however, is really high. This is the #1 issue for Ukraine. Ukraine cares a lot about its own survival and its own future. And its ideal point would be to lock in that future through full membership in NATO, full territorial autonomy. So I've done sort of what Bruno de Mesquita suggests. I should do. I've identified the actors. I've identified these different pieces, and now I have to sort of figure out what's the likely outcome from this. And the way that that works is to essentially calculate a weighted average of how powerful countries are in terms of their salience and their influence, and then weight the ideal points for all those actors together. And so for Russia, I said that their salience was 100 and their influence was 80. And so their power in this particular situation is going to be 8,000. Again, these are arbitrary numbers, but they work in terms of these scales that we've set up. For the West, again, a lot of power, but low salience. And so I said 600 was the power that the West was going to bring to bear in this conflict. And Ukraine has low influence, but high salience. And so they're at 1,500. And so there's a total power sort of deployed in the situation between the salience and the influence of 10,100. And I use those numbers to weight the ideal points for each of those actors. So Russia's 8,000 power gets sort of thrown into sort of pushing things toward the 100 line in that continuum of outcomes. And the West's 600 power that they've put in place is going to sort of push toward the 25 ideal point that the West is advocating for. And Ukraine's 1,500 goes toward the 0 ideal point. And when we sort of add all those weighted values together and divide them by the total power that's being deployed, we end up with a predicted ideal point, a weighted ideal point of 80.69. Which when we sort of return to our continuum of possible outcomes, fall somewhere between Russia gets the Russian areas and retains influence over the rest of Ukraine, and Russia retains influence over a territorially stable Ukraine. So suggesting that maybe it's leaning closer toward Russia is going to seize Russian areas and sort of lock itself into Ukraine for the foreseeable future, that seems to be roughly where things are falling. A slightly worse outcome for Ukraine than I had sort of predicted, just sort of spinning through my own kind of anticipation of the situation. And when we compare that forecast to where we are right now, I think it actually works pretty well. That Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula and seized that and stripped that away from Ukraine, and was able to support sort of militia units in the Russian areas of Ukraine to launch sort of an insurrection, seize governments, buildings, sort of take control, and essentially create a stalemate in Ukraine that makes it so that Ukraine is never really in a stable position unless it's able to sort of appease or remain relatively friendly with Russia, as friendly as you can be with a country that's actively trying to tear territory away from you. But I think that actually fits pretty well with that continuum that we identified. Now, again, this isn't a perfect system. We could go back and quibble, and maybe we would want to workshop some of my predictions about salience or power or ideal points, or maybe this continuum needs to be refined a little bit more. Maybe there's something between that 85 and 65 that we could have articulated ahead of time. But it's a useful way, I think, of thinking about how all the different actors in a situation might operate in that situation, might deploy their attention and their resources, and what the sort of tug of war of that process might end up looking like. Maybe it's not appropriate in every situation, but I found it as a useful tool for thinking through complex situations and developing predictions.